It is starting.
Okay, you're going to kick us off, right?
Mm-hmm. All right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us on this morning. Today, we have some great colleagues of ours from the Michigan Rehabilitation Service talking today about reasonable accommodations. Today, that will be discussing because we know reasonable accommodations are those necessary changes needed to be made for those who have disabilities for them to be able to perform their essential functions at work. So we have some great partners today that will be presenting. We have Stephanie Conklin and we also have Gary Hollick. So please help me welcome them and giving this wonderful presentation. Thank you all so much.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Gary Hollick. I'm a business relations consultant for Michigan Rehabilitation Services, which is part of the state of Michigan. And I've been an employee of the state of Michigan, Michigan Rehabilitation Services for 28 years. As a business relations consultant, I help businesses navigate the world of disability and ADA law, and I assist with reasonable accommodations, helping them connect to our talent base and helping them maintain their talent base. Go ahead, Stephanie.
Hi, I'm Stephanie Conklin. I am an occupational therapist by trade. Been an occupational therapist for 13 years. Also work with Gary with Michigan Rehabilitation Services. I am on the flip side. I work directly with our client customers and businesses with reasonable accommodations in the workplace for job retention, and also our customers seeking employment as well for assistive technology or helping them find the right job for them. So we work together as a team with the client customers and businesses navigating the world of disability.
Okay, so today we're going to talk about reasonable accommodations, as the title says, right? We're going to talk about what they are, when are they required, most importantly, who is responsible for providing reasonable accommodations. We're going to see some case examples to see the process at work, and we're going to wind up with resources to help you move forward, as well as some Q&A at the end. So let's talk a little bit about the why. Why does this matter? As you can see from the slide, disability does impact all of us. All right. We know that right now, approximately 1 in 4 individuals, 1 in 4 adults in the United States have some type of disability that can impact on their lives as well as impact on their ability to work. In 2023, 29% of workers with a disability were employed part-time as compared to only 16% of those with no disability. So we know people with disabilities can work. We know they can be a valuable contributor to our business and help our business succeed, but they're not seeing the opportunities necessarily to work full-time. Also in 2023, we can see that 22.5% of persons with disabilities were employed. This is significant because this is the highest recorded rate since we started tracking data back in 2008. I believe the last statistic was right around 19%. So we're seeing strides, we're seeing gains, but we still know that we want to see more. We want to see more opportunities for people with disabilities to work and to help your company succeed. The other piece we need to know is that approximately 1 in 5 individuals will experience some type of disability in their lifetime as they're working, not necessarily on the job, but those whole years of life that they're working, they will experience some type of disability that does impact at work, and that's where reasonable accommodations can come into play because we want to keep that valuable talent base.
So I'm going to touch a little bit on the American with Disabilities Act, or the ADA. This was a civil rights legislation, a federal law that was passed in 1990 by President George H.W. Bush for protection for persons with disabilities. Now, the background behind this law, it covers individuals with disabilities, just like protections against discrimination against race, sex, religion, origin, ethnicity. So it really just provides those background protections for individuals with disabilities. provides equal opportunity for public places such as your churches, your grocery stores, anywhere anyone should be able to go. A person with a disability should be able to go as well. Also, employment settings, your state and local government services or programs and places, along with any transportation service, your public transportation, your buses. That person with a disability should be able to go anywhere that person without a disability should go. I want to make note that in 2008, this also was amended by George W. Bush, which broadened the interpretation of the word disability. So that included more individuals with disabilities into this group for protections as well. Now, I want to briefly go over the 5 titles of the Americans with Disabilities Act. I am not going to go through all of them today in detail, but just wanted to touch a little bit to make everyone aware that there are the 5 titles, with Title I being employment. That's the most relevant for today. Your Title II is your public services. That's your state and local government services, programs, anything that's under that umbrella. Your Title III, which is your public accommodations, your concert venues, your churches, your grocery stores. Title IV, your telecommunications. That's your closed captioning either on your TV, your computer for live streaming or virtual meetings. Title V is your miscellaneous, anything that falls under these other 4 titles and it's not in that general area. So Title I of the Americans with Disabilities Act is your employment setting. This is any adjustment to the job application. So this is going back to these reasonable accommodations, being sure that a person with a disability has equal access to employment, the same as someone without a disability. Businesses that have 15 or more employees are required to provide reasonable accommodations. Now, a reasonable accommodation is starting from the application period to interviewing to hiring process, but also employment retention as well. So this could include a modification to a physical work environment or the way the job is completed with a reasonable accommodation. The individual with a disability has to have the essential skills with or without reasonable accommodations. Now, an employee that has a disability should have the same access as someone that doesn't have a disability to the same pay or salary, benefits, and access to, let's say, break rooms, bathrooms, Christmas parties, anything that they have to be able to do or are able to do, that person with the disability should have that same access. Now, businesses, I'm going to repeat it because this is really important. Businesses with 15 or more employees are required to provide that reasonable accommodation process and accommodations to that individual with a disability to maintain equal employment opportunities. And I'll turn it over to Gary to talk about what a disability is.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about defining disability. As we talk about definition, we want to keep in mind that when we talk about disability per the ADA, we're talking about a legal definition, not a medical definition. So for other situations where people are trying to maybe qualify for benefits or whatever, they might have a different definition of disability. It might be more of a medical definition. So the Americans with Disabilities Act defines a person with a disability as a person who has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activity. It includes people who have a record or history of such an impairment, even if they do not currently have a disability. It includes individuals who do not have a disability but are regarded or perceived as having a disability. So let's cover those bullets. We'll flip back to substantially limits one or more major life activity. And when I say that, think about what things you would consider a major life activity. And I don't know if they can put that in chat. It'll pop up on the screen, but I believe it will. So if you want to put that in chat, it'll pop up on the screen. Let's see what people think are major life activities. Okay, not seeing any at this point. So that could be cooking, cleaning, eating, sleeping, seeing, hearing, walking, breathing, speaking, learning, sitting, standing, lifting, working, caring for oneself, performing manual tasks. Those are examples of things that could be considered a major life activity. And if one or more of those impact on your ability to function, then you would be considered as having a disability as defined by the ADA. So the second bullet, includes people who have a record or history of such an impairment. Okay, that's a little bit more difficult to understand, but examples could be someone that is in remission from a cancer diagnosis. So at one time they were diagnosed with cancer, now they're considered cancer-free. They still are protected under the ADA as having a disability because they were diagnosed with cancer. Someone who's not currently exhibiting symptoms of a diagnosis. For instance, individuals who have multiple sclerosis or MS can go through periods of being in remission where they don't exhibit symptoms of MS. Individuals with lupus, individuals with Crohn's disease, these are all people that might be currently stable or the condition is well controlled. So they don't necessarily exhibit the symptoms, but they still have a disability. Depression, anxiety, heart conditions, lung conditions, things like that are all considered a disability, although the person may not be exhibiting symptoms of that disability. That third one, individuals who do not have a disability but are regarded or perceived as having a disability. This one is a little more difficult to define, but I'm going to use this example. You're working with an individual, let's say the individual's name was Bob, okay? And Bob, some years ago, we'll say 5, 6, 7 years ago, had a significant car accident. He was out of work for a significant period of time. He was quite injured, spent some time in the hospital. And after a little while, Bob came back to work. He's been working here at the company since. Everything's good. Bob's a great employee, right? So now this time, there's a promotion that people can apply for. Bob applies for that promotion within the company, and he's denied that promotion because the perception is, or it's assumed, that he cannot meet the physical functions or physical demands of the position because at one time he was significantly injured in the car accident. And the conversation could be even, hey, remember when Bob was, injured? He had that real bad car accident. Remember that? There's no way he could do this new job, right? That person was not defined as having a disability. However, the perception is he has a disability and cannot do the job. So that person would be protected under the ADA as well. If you have questions, go ahead and put them in chat. We're going to answer questions at the end of the presentation. So we're going to continue to talk about disability. When we talk about disability, there's two types of disabilities that we can look at. There's visible disabilities, right? So those are disabilities that are immediately apparent to us when we see somebody that has the disability, okay? They might be using some type of assistive device. Maybe they're using a cane, a wheelchair. They have a prosthetic, left leg, left arm, right arm prosthetic. Maybe it's a leg prosthetic and they have shorts on so you can see the prosthetic. Maybe they have hearing aids and they're clearly visible. But when they say I have a disability, you get it. You can see it. And although you don't understand what it's like to have that disability, you have some type of understanding in the back of your mind of what their barriers might be, what they might have to deal with because of that disability. When they say they have a disability, there's no doubt they have a disability, right? They have a wheelchair. They're using a wheelchair. They say I'm paraplegic. It's like, yeah, I get it. You're paraplegic, right? So the visible disabilities are a little easier to understand and even explain to others if we have that disability. And then we talk about invisible disabilities. Those are the not immediately apparent disabilities, okay? Those could be called maybe the hidden disabilities. They're usually internal, okay? Examples on the screen are brain injuries, hard of hearing. Maybe you have hearing aids, but you can't see that I have hearing aids. Arthritis, ADHD, mental illness, visual disabilities. So somebody has difficulty with vision, right? But you can't really see that. They explain that to you, but you really don't see that. And the issue with invisible disabilities, when we work with people, is it may be difficult to understand the cause of the problem or understand the problem, right? If we can't see the evidence of the disability, then we may have difficulty, understanding what they're going through, even appreciating what they're telling us. We want to keep in mind that in the United States, 96% of people with chronic medical conditions show no outward signs of their illness. So they have something they're dealing with, but it's not visual to us. We can't see that. And that's 90% of people, right? And 10% of those individuals experience symptoms that are considered disabling. So the impact on them significantly enough to be considered, by definition, a disability. Okay? When we talk about invisible disabilities, we want to keep in mind how we react to what we don't see. Okay? There's a stigma associated with mental illness, depression, bipolar, anxiety, etc., because of our perception, because we don't understand, right? We can't see it, so we don't get it. And we don't have it, so we don't get it, right? And to give you an example of how people react to invisible disabilities, I'm going to give you an example. You're at Walmart, it's a Saturday morning, you're pulling into the parking lot, you're parking your car, you're there to do your weekly shopping, right? As you get out of the vehicle, some person comes bebopping around in their car, they whip in the accessible parking spot, and they jump out of the car, and they practically beat us to the door of Walmart, okay? What's our immediate reaction? Do we become the ADA police? Do we start looking for that handicap placard hanging from their mirror? Or do they have a handicap accessible license plate, right? What we want to keep in mind is we don't know other people's situation. It may be 99 degrees out, and this is the best this person has felt in 3 weeks. They might have chronic pain, and for some people with chronic pain, they love hot days. Cool days, humid days, they struggle with their pain, okay? So we don't know individuals' life story, and so we want to be very careful of how we react to people that have invisible disabilities. On this screen, I have a list of invisible disabilities, okay? And my disclaimer is this is not an all-inclusive list, okay? This is just a list of some to give you an idea of some of the invisible disabilities that exist that people might be dealing with, okay? As you look at these disabilities, you may have not considered that these were disabilities, okay? However, again, any of these could be considered a disability if the diagnosis limits one or more major life activities, okay, as we defined earlier. Okay, so when we look at this screen, do you identify as maybe having one of these disabilities or a few of these disabilities, or do you know somebody who does? That's just a question to think about. Okay, and as you think about that, what I want you to understand is that a lot of times when we hear disability, it becomes us versus them. So because the able-bodied, right, able-bodied people, and then there's those people with disabilities. What we want to keep in mind is disability impacts on all of us, and it really is all of us. If you're lucky enough right now that you don't have a disability, the likelihood of you experiencing a disability before you pass away from this earth is very high. And the likelihood of you experiencing disability while you're working is very high. Okay. So we're going to talk a little bit about the process of working with accommodation. Okay, we call it a process of discovery in 5 simple steps. What we want to keep in mind as we talk about that is sometimes people overthink disability and they overthink accommodation. And that's real important to keep in mind. Okay. So when somebody has a disability, we want to keep in mind is they might request a reasonable accommodation. Okay. It's much easier if your company has a reasonable request accommodation process in place. That should be a process that's in place and is explained to individuals on day one of employment during orientation. And it's something that is reviewed with them yearly or whenever their annual review is. Okay. So if an individual says, I'm having difficulty with this and I'm requesting a reasonable accommodation, keep in mind they might not know the language real well. Okay. But they're saying, I'm having this issue and I need help. That starts the interactive process, and that is crucial per the ADA. Okay. That's a crucial piece that the ADA is looking for to occur in the reasonable accommodation process. Okay. What we want to keep in mind is that when they make the request, again, it starts a dialogue. They may not know everything they need. They may not know really what they're asking for. Okay, but that starts the dialogue. That starts the conversation back and forth. You may know more about, the accommodation piece, and you may know more about how to have that conversation. The one thing you want to keep in mind is that per the EEOC, okay, and per the ADA, they look at that reasonable accommodation request. But some of the case law I've seen and some of the cases I've been involved in, it's been pointed out that the business should recognize that somebody's struggling, and the business should have a conversation with them. Hey, I notice you're struggling. Maybe you want to request a reasonable accommodation, and this is how you can do so. All right. So the next step is require diagnostics when not obvious and if necessary. Okay. People overthink this. We do not need all their medical information. I think sometimes businesses get insecure because they don't trust the request. All right. But keep in mind that medical documentation is not necessary. Okay. In all cases. If somebody says that, if somebody's a chair user and they say, I need an accommodation to get in and out of the building every day, I need an accessible doorway. Do we need to go bend over, go try to get all the medical documentation out there? No, we don't. Okay. They said they have a disability. They said they have this barrier. And it's pretty obvious that they have a barrier, right? So keep that in mind, that we don't need to go nuts on diagnostics, and we don't need to necessarily every year get more diagnostic information. There are disabilities that people have that are not going to go away, right? So an update yearly could be, is there something else you need because they have some type of chronic disability, okay, that continues to maybe get worse. So it could be, is there not something else you need, but it doesn't have to be more diagnostic information. Okay. Number 3, access accommodation options, collaborate and communicate. So when we talk about coming up with potential accommodations that could help someone, we want to keep in mind is they are the expert. That person that has the disability has dealt with the disability, and they know themselves very well, and they're going to know what might work. Okay. This is an opportunity to reach out for other resources. So the Job Accommodation Network, which we're going to talk about or mention at the end, could be a resource for accommodations. Keeping in mind that's general accommodations, not specific, and we're talking about an individual, right? So we always want to focus on the individual. Okay. And then you could also reach out to your experts here at Michigan Rehabilitation Services. We're geared to help you determine what accommodations make sense for somebody, what accommodations are reasonable, and then how those could be implemented. That would be Stephanie and one of the consultants, Justin or I. Keep in mind that when 2 accommodations meet the same condition, So there might be an accommodation that the individual's requested that meets their needs, and then there's an accommodation you identified that meets their needs. The business gets to choose which accommodation to implement. Okay, so we've already started the conversation on implementing. Okay, so you put the accommodation in place, okay, or accommodations in place, and you have an understanding that we're going to use this accommodation or accommodations for a specific time frame. I put with or without, but we should always look at time frames because we always want to look at that accommodation in the future, 6 months out, a year out. Are they still working? Things change, technology changes, so are they still working? What we want to be really careful here is we don't want to have any unwritten accommodations. All accommodations should be written down so everybody understands the rules of that accommodation, the why behind that accommodation, because you could have new people come into the company, other people leave, and unwritten accommodations are really hard to prove. Okay, they were letting me do this. They've been letting me do this for 10 years. You get a new manager, the new manager says, well, why? Well, they just were because this and this and this is going on. Well, I don't know that. I don't see any documentation of that, right? So make sure our accommodations are written down. This all should be documented. Measure effectiveness over time, okay? You should have ongoing conversations, follow up with the employee. It doesn't have to be any specific time frame, like I said, 3 months, 6 months, a year, but make sure that things are working over time for that individual. Keeping in mind, again, that medical conditions change, technology changes, a lot of things change, and that accommodation may no longer be helpful for that person. And as I said, the process should be clearly documented. Keep in mind, you need 2 people in this process, the interactive process. It's the individual, the employee, and the business. Those are 2 parties that have to be involved in that interactive process. And if the ADA ever gets involved, the EEOC ever gets involved, that's what they're going to be looking at. Was there an interactive process?
So Gary touched a little bit on the process of accommodation. Accommodations are not the same for two people even with the same disability. As he mentioned, they need to be individualized. I've had 2 customers or clients that had the exact same thing, but completely different accommodations. So when we're looking at this, it has to be that interactive process, has to be individualized, and both parties should be at that conversation. Now, I'm going to give you just a couple of examples of accommodations. These are not all inclusive, and they change with technology. It's a big part of it, right? So the first thing, providing an assistive technology. Assistive technology is just something to help that individual be able to do their job at the same level as someone without a disability. So assistive technology could be something like a mouse or a keyboard. It could be an app on a phone, just any piece of technology that helps that person do their job. Now, adjusting or modifying tests or training. This could be a quiet space for training or test taking. So onboarding for a new company, let's say, making sure that that person has accommodations so they can learn the same as someone without a disability is crucial. Acquiring or modifying equipment. I like to use the example as using a regular doorknob versus a door handle. A regular doorknob is really difficult for somebody that maybe has arthritis in their hands or decreased dexterity, whereas a door handle itself is really easy for someone to open if they do have any issues with their hand strength or dexterity. Now, again, these are just really basic, simple accommodations, but modifying somebody's work schedule, maybe part-time hours, working earlier in the day or working later in the day if they're needing extra rest breaks within their time frame that they're supposed to be working. Now, keep in mind, just because somebody has maybe a modified work schedule, it doesn't mean that they get to skip out on work. They are still expected to work the same shift as their colleagues in that same position. So if they're full-time and work 8 hours a day, they're still expected to work that 8 hours a day, but maybe they're working in actually 10 hours and taking 15-minute rest breaks every 2 hours. It just depends on what they need in working with them, because they are the experts in their own bodies since they have been living with that disability for some time. Now, job restructuring, this could be looking at what are the essential functions of the job versus maybe some recommended functions of the job. We see that occasionally with the job descriptions, or if there's another colleague or coworker that could help with some of the essential functions and swapping out the duties. That is a task that we've recommended at times. Now, if all else fails and we really can't find a solution, sometimes reassigning an employee to a better position for them. And it should be equal pay. It should be an equal level of position, but sometimes just finding a better fit for them. So then that way we can accommodate them in that instance. Accommodations are just accommodations. A lot of us do accommodations without even realizing it. So I want you to keep that in the back of your mind as we're talking about this today. Now, we're just going to do a true or false. If anybody's able to access the comments, you can take a guess in there. And it's a business is required to consider reducing productivity or quality of work requirements as a reasonable accommodation. I don't see anything coming through the comments, but this is false. A business is never required to decrease productivity standards or lower the expectations of the quality of work. Now, we could recommend that, hey, if a person is a really good worker, they have the skills needed for a job, but they're struggling with productivity, let's maybe find a time frame and try to find ways to improve their productivity. I had an individual up north that I recommended to the company, the business, hey, let's figure out the productivity standards that he needs to meet and find a way to get him there. And so they actually broke down the task down to the minutes and helped him with more onboarding and training. And he is now still employed. And that was a completely free accommodation with just some extra training for that employee because he was really struggling with that productivity aspect. And they laid out the time frames. Hey, let's make sure that he's meeting this productivity standard in a month or 2 months and making sure everybody's on the same page with that accommodation. So I'm going to just show some examples of reasonable versus unreasonable accommodations. This is a picture of somebody riding a full-size horse through the grocery store as an accommodation. Now, I'm a horse gal, so I always think, wow, this seems really crazy because I would never ride my horse through a grocery store. So this would be an unreasonable accommodation. However, I want you guys to keep in mind, miniature horses are a reasonable accommodation because they are covered under the ADA as a service animal. So a full-size horse, maybe not so much, but a miniature horse can be considered a service animal. Now, an unreasonable accommodation is it has to be required by the business to make sure that the employer has a clear understanding of the accommodation required by the person with a disability. Once an accommodation request is made, the employer must engage in the interactive process like Gary and I have spoke about. When there is more than one accommodation that maybe will meet that need, the employer has that right to choose. Gary already touched on that. We need to be looking at the most cost-effective accommodation that will bridge that gap. What we look at as occupational therapists or consultants out in the field, we look at the individual's functional limitation and what the essential job functions are. I always use the example of building a bridge between the two with that accommodation, but we have to make sure that it's cost effective and it will meet the needs of the customer or client. Now, an employer is required to make reasonable accommodations to the individual, the known disability, as the qualified applicant or employee, as long as it does not impose an undue hardship, which this could be a financial undue hardship or an operational undue hardship. I like to use the example of the operational hardship as one of the clients I was helping at a college or university. They were an assistant to a high level manager, and they needed to be in the office at all times to help greet people as they were coming into the office. Well, that employer is requesting to work from home. And so operationally, that was really difficult for that business to have somebody working from home when they needed to be in that office. Another example is if you have individuals that need to be in-person meetings and they're requesting to work remotely. They can't always meet these requests because it's operationally a hardship. Now, with financial hardship, they have to have clear documentation why it's a financial hardship. If they're a small business, it may be financially really difficult to provide an expensive accommodation. But if they're a really large business that can't afford it, it's a little bit more difficult to prove. There's not like an exact number to prove for the financial hardship. An employer is not required to lower any quality or productivity standards. We've already touched on this. That individual has to be able to complete essential job functions. And so they are not required to eliminate essential job functions to accommodate that employee. So we have another true or false. An employer must eliminate another employee's position to accommodate an individual with a disability if another position is not available. So this is false. They are not required to take away a position of another qualified employee just to accommodate that person with a disability. So we have another example of a reasonable versus unreasonable accommodation. I'm going to give some background scenario on this slide here. This is a mom and pop diner that they have an employee that has to go into the basement to get stock. And the employee is now saying that they can no longer do the stairs to get into the basement. They're requesting that an elevator be built for this employee or for this employer, which would be very costly. It may put this mom and pop diner out of existence. So we have to make sure we're keeping these small businesses going. Otherwise, the employee will not have a business to return to. So some suggestions that we may make for this unreasonable request would be possibly having another employee go down into the basement to get the stock and maybe bring some stock up so it's more accessible for that individual with a disability, and swapping out the job functions a little bit to make sure that it's still the employee still meeting the needs of the business and with that other employee that's helping them. We want to make sure it's a level playing field across. So I'm going to go briefly over a case that I worked on last year up in the Upper Peninsula. He is an individual that had a congenital disorder that he was born with and diagnosed at 4 months old, and he had arthrogryposis. What this meant was that his joints could not go through a full range of motion. He was born with what we call contractures, meaning his right arm was basically stuck at a 90-degree angle. He could not straighten it all the way. His left arm was stuck at a 100-degree angle, and again, he couldn't straighten it. He also had other physical limitations due to the arthrogryposis. He had some back and hip pain that often would start at a 3 out of 10 on the Likert scale, but by the end of the day, it was up towards a 7 or 8 out of 10 after working. And then he also had some tingling in both hands with some joint limitations at his wrist as well. Along with these physical limitations from the arthrogryposis, he also was diagnosed with ADHD with a learning disability. He had a lot of hyper attention and hyper focus. During my evaluation, he was up moving, and I just allowed him to kind of get up and move around. We spoke, I wrote some things down, but in his job, he did very well. So he was employed by a co-op in Marquette, and he worked at the deli counter. In the deli counter, he had a hot case, a cold case that he would serve foods out of, salads, hot wings. mac and cheese, all different varieties, and it changed day by day. But he also was responsible for managing a salad bar. They also had another cold case with like deli sandwiches out in the main shopping area. Then they had a coffee station. They let the customers have free coffee while they were shopping the co-op. He was responsible for hauling the coffee, making the coffee, and then hauling it to the coffee station. Then in the back, they also had a deli sandwich prep area that he had to stand and make the deli sandwiches. So he had a lot of job duties. He also had to get items out of the refrigeration unit, like salads, the deli meats, the cheeses. And they had a small step stool that he could stand on to get up and retrieve those items. What we do as occupational therapy consultants, I went up to the UP. I completed a work site evaluation in collaboration with the business, the employee. And I looked at what are his functional limitations and what are the needed job duties that he has to do and what was he having difficulty with. So what I did is I went through and I looked at everything that he had to be able to do. And then I figured out what exactly we could do to bridge the gaps. Overall, it was like very minimal, but what he had is he had some difficulty gripping items in the hot case. And if you can see in this first picture, that was the hot pad that they were using to retrieve items out of the hot case. And he was often concerned with burning himself. And so that was a safety issue. He was having difficulty grabbing the spoons out of the cold and hot case. Difficulty carrying that full coffee canister dispenser over to the coffee or the customer counter. They had a cart that they were recommending that he used, but he was also 6'2", so he was very tall, and he was having to bend over to get the items where he needed to go. So he was having a lot of back pain because of that. And then he was having a lot of difficulty retrieving the items out of the refrigeration unit, and then also sweeping and mopping floors at the end of his shift. So I looked at these limitations, and then I went in and said, what accommodations can we use to bridge the gap? So the accommodations I recommended for him were actually fairly simple things. Large handled spoons that had grips on them, a non-slip hot pad, so in that way he could grip things out of that hot case a little easier. The deli counter where they were preparing the sandwiches was too low for him, but it wasn't realistic to add a height adjustable table. So I recommended a portable workstation that was a little elevated, about 9 inches, and he could put a nonstick kind of film on it. So in that way, the food would not move around on it. That was disposable. So if it got dirty, he could throw it away. A stool with handles, very easy solution to get those items out of the refrigeration unit. Then I also recommended, it's called a robo handle for mops and the brooms. So he was able to sweep after he started using that. And there's a whole inclusive list here. I won't go through every single one for the sake of time, but just know that these were all really easy accommodations. And really, after just maybe a couple $100, the business was able to accommodate him. The most expensive thing I recommended was that stool with the handles. And they worked with Michigan Rehabilitation Services to make sure he had the equipment he needed. And he is still employed today at the Marquette Food Co-op.
Thank you, Stephanie. So one of the things that Stephanie pointed out was that the accommodations were minimal and they weren't that expensive. So what we want to keep in mind is that a lot of times businesses will kind of worry about cost, okay? And we want to keep in mind that in most situations, reasonable accommodations, the cost is very minimal. So the next case study we're going to talk about is Thermotron. Some of you may have heard of Thermotron, but Thermotron is a company that tests everything that we use for electronics. So what they do is they build these sealed rooms that are weather controlled for the purpose of testing electronics. So if you have a phone, which we all do, right? It's been tested probably by a company like Thermotron. So our customer, you could see, we would say that she's a short person, and we could say that because she calls herself that, or a little person. But she was 3 feet 11 inches tall. She graduated from high school with a diploma, and she wanted to be a welder. That's what she wanted to do. She has chronic lung disease and had surgery to repair curvature of her spine. She has physical restrictions in lifting no more than 20 pounds, reaching and bending. She also evokes safety concerns because of her limitations of her reach. So if she's reaching across the counter, a lot of times she's having to put basically her upper body on the counter. She's reaching across the counter, right? So like I said, she wanted to be a welder. Because of her dwarfism, her arms and legs are not proportionate to her body. Okay, so those were the concerns kind of going in. And the fortunate thing with Thermotron is because of what Thermotron does, they have a bunch of engineers, and the engineers really got behind how can we help this person with accommodations. One of the things we want to keep in mind is a lot of times that individuals that have dwarfism, okay, there's not a lot of equipment necessarily, like shoes and stuff like that. That when you think about safety shoes with steel toes and stuff like that, it's hard to find that for people that are small, right? So for standing on cement, we recommended the U-size insert. We also recommended a spring caster on 4 legs as a step stool, so she could step up on that. We also recommended a bandsaw to cut copper tubing. And again, the engineers were instrumental in helping us figure out what makes sense for her as far as their equipment they needed to use for the job. And they helped make that bandsaw usable by her. They made engineering changes to that bandsaw so it was usable by her. And you can see the slide. This is an older slide. It says she's been employed as a live worker spot welder for 3 months. That's actually now 2.5 years that she's been working as a welder successfully for this company. And she's actually promoted up within the company as she's learned more welding tasks. So this is an example of, accommodations that can be put in place for somebody that works in a production job. So we're going to skip this next one. In the interest of time, I want to make sure we have time for questions. But again, a welder, he was coming back to work after losing his left leg due to diabetes. He has prosthetic, left leg below the knee amputation. And the business just said, hey, we want to bring him back, but we don't know how to do it. So again, we could step in. I brought an OT up to this business up in a northern county that I work with. And we went through, we looked at what accommodations make sense for this person. And those accommodations have been implemented. And he's actually promoted up within the company twice. And this was 5-6 years ago that we did this with this company. So when you look at accommodations, it's helping you as a business to continue to keep valuable people, right? Businesses tell me all the time they don't want to lose that brain drain, right? They don't want to lose that knowledge. So accommodations can help you keep individuals. So just a kind of a summary. We look at the slide, accommodation considerations. We want to consider what limitations are or is the employee experiencing. How do these limitations affect the employee and the employee's job performance? What specific job tasks are problematic as a result of these limitations? What accommodations are available to reduce or eliminate these problems? Are all possible resources being used to determine possible accommodations? Are we just keeping it in-house, or are we looking to have conversations with the experts, like the people through the Job Accommodation Network, Michigan Rehab Services, for instance? Once accommodations are in place, would it be useful to meet with the employee to evaluate the effectiveness of the accommodations and determine whether additional accommodations are needed? That would be yes, right, in most cases. And do supervisor, personnel, and employees need training? And that would be a yes. And I would say all the time, because staff is constantly changing, right? And understanding accommodations is something that everybody should really understand. You may have somebody that you're working with that has asked for a reasonable accommodation and they are now receiving that accommodation, but you have other people that are wondering why, the why behind that, which you can't reveal, right? But you can at least have training so everybody understands the value of accommodations. So some of the resources that are available to you, Michigan Rehabilitation Services, like we said, we're there to help you, Mr. and Mrs. Business, be successful. We're going to help you maintain your employee base and help figure out what accommodations might work best to keep your employees working. You got the Employer Assistance and Resource Network, Ask Earn. You have the Job Accommodation Network, which I talked about. A very complete and wonderful site. What we want to keep in mind is when they talk about accommodations, they're talking about a diagnosis or limitations of a diagnosis from a generic standpoint. We want to keep in mind that accommodations are individual. One person that uses a chair or wheelchair may not necessarily need the same accommodations as another person that uses a wheelchair. And there's some of our other resources. You can take a picture of the screen. We'll move on to our questions and answers. So we're opening up for questions and answers right now. We got you for 8 minutes. So were there any that came in during the presentation?
Yes. Yep. And I will show it. So, question from Jocelyn, it says, have you ever come across a situation where someone very clearly has a visual disability, for instance, a cane, oxygen tank, back brace, something along those lines? However, the applicant or employee does not acknowledge said disabilities when applying or working. How do you navigate that conversation, especially if there is a concern that they would at the very least need accommodations to be able to complete the work?
So it could be a concern how to have that conversation, right? I would say standard operating procedure for any conversation with anybody applies is you have a conversation with them. You can list the essential functions of the job verbally, or you could say, have you read the job description? And did you note the essential functions of the job? And they acknowledge yes. And then you say, can you perform the essential functions of the job with or without a reasonable accommodation? That way, you're not singling out that person. It's verbiage you use for every applicant. So you're not singling out that person because they're using a cane or whatever. Okay. And then you get an opportunity for them to say yes or no. And then if you have any questions about a specific one, you could say, can you tell me how you would do this job with or without a reasonable accommodation? Stephanie, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
No, I think that's great. And I think just having that conversation so you're not singling somebody out is really important, because you don't want them to feel self-conscious about whatever disability they have, but just going about and saying, hey, how would you do this? And would you need anything to help you, if they don't really want to come forward with it at that point?
Yeah, and really good practice is just having a process that's across the board with every applicant.
Everybody.
Okay. Even from application process, right? You have an interview on such and such a date at such and such a time. Is there anything you need to be able to do that interview effectively? Is there any accommodations you might need? That way you're not singling out anybody based on what you're seeing. It's verbiage across the board.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for answering that. And if anyone has any questions, please feel free to comment it below. So we have another, we don't have a question, but it's a comment. You might want to expound on that. Let me put that on the screen. Brenda says, I'm just another observer here, but would handle, and I believe this was for the reasonable or unreasonable scenario. She said, but would handle as any other new applicant / hire. I wouldn't address it in the interview process, but once hired, I always address the employee's right in orientation, including their right to the ADA accommodations from day one versus FMLA or STD, which is a 1-year wait. I always make them feel comfortable with the conversation as the first step.
Absolutely. And what's great about that is if somebody has a disability that might be a concern of theirs, right? And they're concerned about being able to do something, right? But they don't want to disclose because they really want a job, right? Everybody wants to work. So they don't want that to be the reason you don't hire. So if you make them feel comfortable from day one, they're going to feel comfortable sharing with you any concerns they might have in their ability to perform the essential functions of the job. So yeah, that's great. Thank you for that.
All righty. I don't see any other questions in the chat. Just
okay. So our last screen, you can see we have a QR code there. Please open up the camera feature on your phone. Put your camera on the QR code if you would. You should be able to capture that QR code. A link should pop up, and then you can go ahead and fill out a survey. We want to make sure that what we brought to you today is valuable. It's something that you value. Any suggestions you have for other topics, any concerns you have about the presentation or anything like that, we want to hear from you. And it takes 15 seconds. So please do that survey. It's very important that we get that feedback. The good-looking guy here standing there teaching, that's Justin Skibbin. He's our colleague. He asked Stephanie and I to present today. He covers the Flint region, Flint and East, and in the Thumb area. He helps cover that area. So he would be the consultant you would reach out to initially if you have any questions or needs as a business on how to navigate that conversation for reasonable accommodation. Keep in mind, our goal is to serve business and help business be successful. We're there as your ally. We're there to help you understand what they are, who's responsible, what next steps could be. We're there for you. So if you got any questions, you want further conversation with Stephanie or I, you can reach out to Justin and he can help facilitate that conversation.
all right. Thank you so much. Stephanie, do you have any last words?
No, thank you so much for having us. I hope the discussion helped understand reasonable accommodations in the process.
Absolutely. So thank you all so much for tuning in today for this discussion about what you need to know about reasonable accommodations. Both Stephanie and Gary have provided great information about disability, about accommodations, and provided some great resources. So thank you so much again for tuning in today. If you would like to stay connected to the Flint and Genesee, please go to educateflintandgenesee.org for further business trainings. If you all have any ideas or any requests for other topics for business training, please go to that site. We do have an upcoming session coming up again if you would like to register for our next business training. But other than that, we thank you so much for attending. Please take some time to go to that QR code and complete that survey on today's session. Other than that, thank you all so much and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.